Rhiannon, Ceridwen, and Arianhod. Why is it that we don't see anything in history in regards to these gods? What we do see are gods like Cocidius, Belatucadrus, and Sulis. These are the gods we see from the historical record. So why then are those gods that we most commonly know as being Celtic gods not represented in history? Well, today, that's what I want to find out. So let's start at the beginning and let's look at what sources of information that is available to us that document Celtic history. So the first source of information is the evidence turned up by archaeological digs. So it's the archaeological source, and it's the artifacts and the statues and the iconography, the hard evidence that's turned up. The second source of information is the narrative record. And there are two types of narrative record. We have the historical narrative record that are given to us through the classic writings of Julius Caesar and Tacitus. And then we have mythological. The mythological narrative record, such as we see in the Mabinogi. Now, the problem with the Celts prior to the Romans is that they never bothered to write anything down. They never kept any written records. They never worshipped their gods in any visual form. So it wasn't until the Romans arrived that we started to see evidence of the veneration of these gods. Now, when the Romans came along, well, they were all excited about these gods. Britain was an exotic place to them, and it seems like, to some extent, they behaved like tourists, and they ended up building all these big spas and health, well, you could call them health centres. Places where people would come and they'd stay and recuperate and they'd have a bit of a rest at these spas, and they'd hope that Nordens or Sulis would heal their injuries and cure all their ills. So we ended up with the Romans building all these spas and sanctuaries across the country that they used to venerate the local gods. It was probably quite exciting and quite the talking point to tell people how you were going to spend a couple of days down at the baths in veneration of Sulis, or you would be spending some time up at the sanctuary of Nordens, these exotic gods. And the Romans were here for over 350 years. And so they built a lot of these sanctuaries and spas. And so in regards to the archaeological mythological record, what we see is what was left to us by the Romans. And it was the same with the narrative record from that time. They were also given to us by the Romans, the classical writings of Caesar, Posidonius, Strabo, and of course Tacitus. The Celts themselves, well, as I've mentioned before, they never created any imagery, and most of their knowledge was handed down word of mouth. So perhaps stories were told around the campfire. So what we're getting from the historical and archaeological record at the time comes from the Romans. And it was the gods that they thought were exotic. And of course, they all ended up with Latin names and were syncretized to the Roman gods. And so we had Apollo Grannus and Silvanus Cocidius and Sulis Minerva. So where then are the common Celtic goddesses like Ceridwen, Arianhod, Rhiannon, the Morrigan? What about Dylan? What about Bran? Where are these gods? So these gods and goddesses come from a different part of the narrative record. They came from the mythological side of things, and this is the historical narrative record that was written down much later on, mostly between the 11th and 13th century. And just because they came from the mythological record doesn't mean they had no bearing in history. It's just that these gods and goddesses came to us word of mouth over centuries, and they were eventually written down in the 11th and 13th century. So in some ways, it's arguable that the mythological record is closer to the beliefs of the Celts at the time, except that seeing as the stories were handed down word of mouth, then some things were obviously embellished or names were corrupted. But still, both sources, the archaeology and the mythology, although to a large extent they don't seem to validate each other, they are both valid. But then there are a few gods and goddesses that come to us through the Mabinogi that we do see a correlation with on the historical record, such as LLeu and the historical god Leu, or Lugus as he was known on the continent. And then there's Mapon and Maponus, and then there's the god Nuth, and the Romans built a shrine to the god Nodens down at Lydney Park on the Severn River. And so was Rhiannon. Who'd thought her name Rhiannon was a corruption of the Brythonic word rigatona, and rigatona meant great queen, and it's thought that she was actually the British equivalent of Epona, the horse goddess from Gaul. So, although the two sources don't add up completely, they can, and do to some extent, validate each other. Now, if you've enjoyed today's episode, found it interesting, then please don't forget to give us a thumbs up. And if you have any questions, leave them in the comments down below. And with that, I'll see you again very soon.